$250,000. That is what moved out of my grandfather's estate account in the 6 weeks after my cousins convinced the bank they were already in charge of it. He wanted it split his way, not evenly, my cousin told me, standing in a probate office that still smelled like the lilies from his funeral. I let the sentence sit in the air for exactly as long as it took the case number to load on my phone, because in 9 minutes, the court's own file was about to tell this entire family something my cousins had spent 6 weeks hoping nobody would ever check. If you have ever watched a family assign themselves an inheritance before the paperwork ever agreed with them, you already know exactly how loud a case file can be. My name is Miriam Castellano. I am 34 and I work as an estate and trust account officer for a regional bank, which means I spend my days verifying exactly one thing before a single dollar moves out of a deceased person's account: whether the person asking for it actually has the legal authority to ask. Needing that particular skill for my own grandfather's estate was never something I expected, but I have learned that grief makes families forget the difference between who they believe should be in charge and who a court has actually named, just as easily as strangers forget it. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense without my grandfather, Bernard Whitfield, and without the 6 weeks between his funeral and the morning I stood in that probate office reading a case number off my own phone. His den still smells exactly as it always did: pipe tobacco gone faint into the curtains, a shelf of fishing lures he never once got around to organizing properly, a mug shaped like a largemouth bass that my grandmother bought him as a joke decades ago, and that somehow became his favorite coffee cup for the rest of his life. My core wound, the one my therapist, Dr. Lucienne Park, has been circling for almost 2 years, is what she calls the vending machine, the reflex where someone else's need drops in like a coin and out comes my time, my calm handling of the thing nobody else wanted to handle. No invoice attached, because asking for one always felt like betraying the family. I built that reflex early, and I built it specifically in my grandfather's den, the one with the roll-top desk and the smell of pipe tobacco that never quite left the curtains, watching him balance his own checkbook out loud because I was the only grandchild who ever asked him a real question about how any of it worked. Here is the part that is hard to admit. Being the one who understood his paperwork had started to feel like the only kind of closeness I knew how to offer him. And some nights, I was not sure whether I loved that role or was simply afraid of what would happen to my place in the family if I ever stopped playing it. My mother used to say Miriam Castellano was the only grandchild who ever sat still long enough at that desk to actually learn something. And I never corrected her, because it was easier to be praised for patience than to admit I was scared of what happened if I stopped being useful. My grandfather died 11 weeks ago, at 87, in his sleep, in the same house where that rototop desk still sits, the same brass lamp still bent at the same slight angle over its writing surface. His will was simple and specific, drafted 3 years earlier with an attorney he trusted, naming me as sole executor and dividing the $250,000 in his estate account according to a schedule he had written out himself in his own careful hand. Larger shares to the grandchildren who had stayed close, smaller ones to those who hadn't visited in years. Everyone in the family had heard him joke about that schedule at holidays for years, usually over a slice of the same lemon pound cake my grandmother used to bake before she passed. Nobody had ever thought to write it down themselves because he was the one who wrote everything down, in pencil first, then traced over in ink once he was sure. My Aunt Sandra Reyes, my mother's older sister, called a family lunch 3 weeks after the funeral, framed gently as a chance for everyone to grieve together over something other than paperwork. I drove to the same restaurant where we'd held his memorial reception, a place with heavy wooden booths and a fireplace that stayed lit even in summer, the smell of wood smoke mixing faintly with garlic bread and a sangria pitcher already sweating rings on the table when I arrived. A bread basket sat untouched in the center, a pat of butter going soft in its little ceramic dish, and someone had already ordered a round of the same appetizer Grandpa Bernard used to get every single visit, as if ordering it might summon some version of the afternoon that wasn't actually happening. I ordered black coffee, something small enough to leave half finished if I needed to. The lunch started warm enough, actual warm. Cousins trading stories about the fishing trips he used to organize every June, Derek doing an exaggerated impression of Grandpa Bernard falling asleep mid-sentence in his recliner, the whole table laughing in the easy, unguarded way families laugh when nobody has decided yet to ruin the afternoon. I let myself enjoy 20 minutes of it before I noticed Sandra checking her phone twice under the table, quick glances she thought nobody caught. Stay close through the next part, because the sentence my cousin says over dessert that afternoon is the exact sentence a probate clerk read back to an entire family 9 weeks later, word for word, off an official court transcript nobody in that booth had thought to request. My cousin Kristen Reyes, Sandra's daughter, waited until the check had come before she said it, wine glass still half full, voice pitched just loud enough for the whole table to hear. Her brother, my cousin Derek Reyes, nodded along without looking up from his phone. My uncle Gordon Whitfield, my grandfather's only son, sat quietly at the end of the booth, turning his water glass in slow circles, saying nothing at all, which I would later understand meant something very specific. I did not raise my voice. I did not put down my mug because I had not picked it up yet, and some old professional instinct told me to keep both hands empty and visible, documenting a scene instead of starring in it. I want to be honest about what I felt sitting in that booth because I promised myself I would not sand down the ugly parts of this story. I felt exactly 10 years old again, sitting at that roll-top desk, discovering all over again that being trusted with the numbers was not the same thing as being trusted with a decision. I did not confront anyone that afternoon. I finished my coffee, I hugged my aunt goodbye, and I drove home turning one detail over and over, that my grandfather's actual signed schedule was sitting in a fireproof box in his den, and not one person at that table had mentioned it once. I called my coworker and closest friend, Owen Delacroix, from my car before I even left the parking lot, the engine still off, my hands cold against the steering wheel, because Owen has heard more about my extended family than any colleague should ever have to hear for free. I told him what Kristen said. He was quiet a second, then he said, "That wasn't about grieving properly, Miriam Castellano. That was a message. You need to find out who it was actually for." I saw Dr. Park that Thursday, the appointment already on the calendar from months earlier. Good timing dressed up as coincidence. She asked me the question she always asks when I am circling something instead of naming it directly. What would you do here if you trusted your own read of the situation completely? I told her I would check the estate account's activity log. She nodded like that was obvious, because to her it probably was. Here's where I have to admit something uncomfortable, which is that being a professional who verifies strangers' executor authority every single day had made me better at protecting other families' estates than my own, because with strangers, I never let sentiment slow down the verification. With my own grandfather's account, I had been slow. I had let 3 weeks of grief convince me that a family lunch was simply family being family, not a rehearsal for something already in motion. 4 days after that lunch, I was helping my mother sort through Grandpa Bernard's old email account, the same cracked laptop still sitting on his kitchen table, exactly where he'd left it, a coffee ring permanently stained into the wood beside it, mostly so I could archive his photos before the provider closed it. I found a message thread that had been auto-forwarded into his inbox by mistake through some shared family calendar setting Sandra had never understood she'd left on. The subject line read, "Estate Timing," and the preview line was already visible before I ever opened it. My mother, standing behind me with a dish towel still in her hands, asked what Miriam Castellano had found, and I had no answer yet that felt safe to say out loud. The thread had 2 names on it, Sandra and Kristen, dated the week after the funeral. Sandra had written that the bank might release partial funds to whoever presented themselves as already handling things before the will was formally probated, since some banks moved faster on family requests than on court paperwork. Kristen's reply read, "Then we just tell them Grandpa wanted it split his way, not evenly, and that we're already handling it. Nobody at the bank will know to ask Miriam Castellano first if we get there before probate does." I read that message 4 times in my mother's kitchen, the house gone quiet around me, and I felt something shift from cold to precise. This had never been about grief moving slowly. It had been about a 6-week window between a death and a probated will, and somebody hoping to walk through it before the paperwork caught up. Here's the first thing this ambush actually taught me, and it is smaller and colder than the rest of the story. A will does not care how confidently someone stands in front of a bank teller and says they are already handling things. It only cares whose name a court has actually entered into the record, and nobody in that booth had checked. I decided that night I was not going to fight Sandra and Kristen with accusations across a table. I was going to do what I do for a living, which is verify authority before a single dollar moves. And I was going to make sure whatever story they were telling the bank would not survive contact with the probate court's own file. The next morning, I called the probate court clerk's office using my professional credentials rather than my family name, giving the case file my own name plainly, Miriam Castellano, before asking a former colleague there, carefully, generally, whether an estate case she could not confirm by name for privacy reasons, but that I described closely enough, had an executor of record yet. She would not confirm details directly. She did tell me, gently, that most courts require a formal letters testamentary filing before any executor has legal authority to direct fund releases, and that any bank employee who released estate funds without seeing that filing was taking on real personal liability for doing so. I filed my own letters testamentary petition that same week, using the original will from my grandfather's fireproof box, along with the formal notice to his bank flagging the account for verification hold pending probate. I did this quietly, the way you close a door before a storm instead of after one. 6 weeks after the funeral, my mother called me in tears, her voice thin over a bad connection, saying Sandra had told her the account had already been partially released, that Kristen had gone to the bank herself with a copy of the will and convinced a branch employee to expedite something. I could hear my mother's kitchen faucet running in the background, left on and forgotten, a small sign of how upset she'd let herself become. I called the bank's estate department directly that afternoon, using my own professional login credentials this time rather than a family phone call, giving my full name for the internal file, Miriam Castellano, and confirmed that a release request had in fact been submitted 3 days earlier, flagged, and placed under compliance review pending verification of executor authority, exactly the safeguard I had requested in writing the week before. My Uncle Gordon called me 2 days after that, his voice careful in a way that made the back of my neck prickle. He wanted to talk, he said, about something that had been sitting wrong with him since the funeral. I listened. I asked clarifying questions, keeping what I already knew to myself, and I wrote down every word the moment we hung up, because a written record beats a memory every single time a memory gets challenged later.
3 weeks before the deadline the court had set for probate objections, my cousin Derek texted me almost the same sentiment Kristen had used at that first lunch, that I always needed to make everything official, and that some things in families just worked better on trust than on paperwork. He sent it at 11 at night, 3 separate messages instead of 1, each rewritten slightly from the last, as though he were rehearsing the sentiment more than settling on the wording, and I read all 3 twice before setting my phone face down on the counter without replying. 2 weeks before, Aunt Sandra called to say that with everyone still grieving, it really would be easier if I simply let the family handle disbursements informally, without dragging lawyers and court dates into something that should stay between family. I could hear her kitchen radio playing faintly behind her voice, the same classic rock station Grandpa Bernard used to keep tuned in his den. And for one strange second, the familiarity of that sound almost softened what she was actually asking me to give up. 1 week before, Uncle Gordon drove out to see me alone, without telling Sandra, his truck idling in my driveway for a full minute before he came to the door, like he was still deciding whether to knock it all. He stood on my porch in his work jacket, still smelling faintly of sawdust from whatever job he'd come from, and asked if he could come in for just a minute, just to talk something through. We sat at my kitchen table, the same kind of surface Grandpa Bernard used to balance his own checkbook on, and Gordon turned his coffee mug in slow circles the whole time he talked, the same nervous habit I remembered from every family dinner where he'd rather listen than speak. He told me Kristen had shown him a handwritten note, supposedly copied from something Grandpa Bernard had once said out loud, claiming an uneven split favoring Sandra's side of the family, and that when he'd asked to see the actual will himself, Kristen had told him doubting family was exactly the kind of thing that kept Grandpa up at night in his final years. I asked him, gently, whether he'd ever actually seen the will itself, the real one, filed with an attorney. He admitted he had not, and that admission seemed to cost him something to say out loud. Gordon avoided signing anything that day, or in the weeks after. He told me he'd kept the note in his truck's glove box for 2 weeks, too unsettled to either agree with it or throw it away, the paper going soft at the folds from being taken out and put back so many times, a faint ring of coffee staining one corner from a cup that had once sat too close to it on his dashboard. Keep watching, because what my uncle does with that note at the hearing itself, in front of the entire family, is the reason nobody in this family ever brought up an uneven split again after that day. I retrieved that note from Gordon with his permission and had it compared, side by side under a desk lamp at the attorney's office, against my grandfather's actual handwriting on file. 3 sample documents spread across the conference table between us. Miriam Castellano watched the attorney's paralegal lay a magnifying loupe over both signatures without saying a word for almost a full minute, the lamp's small circle of light the only sound-adjacent thing in that quiet office besides a ceiling fan clicking faintly overhead. It did not match. It had never been in his hand at all. It had been typed, then traced over in a shaky approximation of his signature style, the kind of forgery that survives a glance across a truck's dashboard, but not a single side-by-side comparison under proper light. The probate hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday, in the same courthouse where I had filed my own petition 6 weeks earlier, a squat brick building with a metal detector at the door and a directory board missing 3 of its plastic letters. I stood in the hallway outside that morning, watching a custodian buff a scuff mark out of the linoleum with slow, even strokes, and I felt something settle in my chest that had nothing to do with hope and everything to do with the folder in my bag. I had not slept well the night before, not from fear exactly, more from the sharp, wide-awake feeling that comes before you finally get to say a true thing out loud in a room full of people who have spent weeks pretending it wasn't true. I had gone over the binder twice more at my kitchen table the night before, checking the tabs one final time, though I already knew every page inside it by heart. Owen had texted me at 8 that morning, just one line, "You've got this," and I'd read it twice before putting my phone away for the rest of the drive. The hearing room filled the way these rooms always do, folding chairs bolted in uneven rows, a water-stained ceiling tile over the jury box nobody had ever fixed, a court reporter setting up her machine near the bench with the brisk efficiency of someone who has typed 1,000 family disputes into the record and stopped being surprised by any of them. Sandra sat near the front with Kristen and Derek, all 3 in the kind of dark, deliberate clothing people wear when they want a judge to read competence instead of desperation. Gordon sat a row behind them, alone, his hands folded so tightly in his lap that his knuckles had gone pale.
Miriam Castellano sat with her mother, the same fireproof box's contents now organized into a binder on her lap, tabbed and labeled exactly like a disputed account file at work, because some habits do not know the difference between a courtroom and a conference room. A young clerk's assistant named Theo moved quietly along the aisle handing out case number slips, maybe 20 years old, a lanyard with his name badge turned backward against his chest, working through what was clearly a long docket with the same careful, watchful attention I remembered from my own first year at the bank, learning which files mattered before anyone told him directly. He caught my eye once, just briefly, and something in his glance told me he had already clocked which family in that room was about to have a very different morning than they expected. I want you to picture the actual folder in my lap for a moment, because it matters more than it looks like it should. Tan, slightly worn at the corners from 6 weeks of being carried between my apartment and the bank and my mother's kitchen table. 3 color-coded tabs marking the will, the Letters Testamentary filing, and the bank's compliance denial. A paperclip bent slightly out of shape from being opened and closed so many times I had lost count. Bernard Whitfield's actual signature sat behind the first tab. The same signature I had watched him practice slowly at that roll-top desk decades earlier, patient with himself, never once rushing a signature, unlike so many of the people now sitting a few rows ahead of me. The bailiff called our docket a little after 10, and the judge, a woman with reading glasses pushed low on her nose and a voice that had clearly settled 1,000 quieter arguments than this one, asked both sides to state their business plainly. Sandra's attorney rose first, buttoning his jacket with the unhurried confidence of a man who had done this exact motion 100 times, and asserted that the family had reached an informal agreement regarding disbursement that better reflected the deceased's true wishes, an agreement he described as documented, though he did not specify by whom. He spoke for nearly 4 minutes, citing family harmony and the deceased's known preferences, without once mentioning a will, a signature, or a filed instrument of any kind. The particular smoothness of someone paid to make an unsteady claim sounds settled. The judge listened without expression, tapping her pen once against a legal pad, and asked whether counsel intended to introduce documentation supporting the claim. He said the family's testimony would speak for itself. Kristen leaned forward in her chair, one hand flat on the table in front of her, and said it one more time, the same sentence from that first lunch, word for word, because people who believe they are winning rarely bother to change their script. He wanted it split his way, not evenly. Derek nodded beside her. Sandra reached over and squeezed Kristen's hand in visible support. This is the moment I want you to understand clearly, because it is the center of everything. My attorney asked the court to verify the filed letters testamentary and the estate account's current hold status, live, on the record. The clerk's office was called on the courtroom's own speaker line in front of the entire docket. The first attempt reached a general court services queue, a recorded menu with nothing about probate holds at all. The second attempt transferred twice before landing on hold, Kristen's face going tight in the silence the way a page goes pale when the ink finally runs out. The third attempt reached a records officer directly, and she confirmed, on speaker, in front of the judge and both families, that letters testamentary had been granted to Miriam Castellano 6 weeks earlier, that no competing petition had ever been filed, and that the estate account remained under a compliance hold specifically due to an unauthorized release request submitted by Kristen Reyes. Derek's jaw tightened. Sandra's hands went flat against the table in front of her. I did not stop there, because a single confirmation can still be argued away as a misunderstanding if you let it stand alone. My attorney then placed a second call to the bank's estate compliance line on speaker, and a compliance officer confirmed that the release request had been denied specifically because Kristen Reyes held no signing authority on the account, and that the note presented as supporting documentation did not match the decedent's verified signature on file. That was when my Uncle Gordon stood up, the note itself in his hand, the paper soft at the folds from 2 weeks in his glove box, a faint crease running through the middle where his knee had pressed against it during the drive over.
He said he wanted the court to know that this same note had been shown to him privately weeks earlier, and that he had been told, in his sister's own words, that Dad wanted it split his way, not evenly, and that downing it was exactly the kind of thing that would have hurt him. He looked at Sandra directly and said it back to her, low and even. You told me he wanted it split his way, not evenly. Well, Sandra, that was never his hand on that note, and it was never his voice either. It was yours, and I let you talk me into carrying it for 2 weeks before I finally looked closely enough to see it. For 1 full second, I felt the weight of an account that had sat frozen for 6 weeks finally being read correctly in front of the one person who had almost signed on the strength of a forged line instead of a filed one. I understood, sitting in that courtroom, that a family can carry a false authority the same way an estate carries an unresolved claim, quietly, until somebody finally forces the actual record into the light, where a judge has to look at it plainly. Sandra's composure did not crack all at once. First, a brittle correction, insisting Gordon had misunderstood the note's origin entirely. Second, when the judge asked her directly whether she had drafted it, a longer pause than any lawyer in that room wanted to hear from a client. Third, when Kristen would not meet her mother's eyes and Derek quietly slid his chair an inch away from the table, something in Sandra's face simply gave out, thinner and more frightened than I had ever once seen her at any holiday table. The judge confirmed my Letters Testamentary as the sole valid authority on the estate, ordered the compliance hold lifted for disbursement according to the original will's schedule, and referred the forged note to the court's own fraud unit for further review. My voice stayed level through all of it. I stood only once to thank the judge and to ask that my grandfather's original schedule be entered into the record exactly as he had written it, nothing added, nothing softened. I do not need to tell you every word said in that hallway afterward. Most of it was smaller and quieter. People gathering folders, Derek staring at his shoes in the vague, unfocused way people do when they realize they picked the wrong side of a fight they never fully understood. Gordon found me near the elevator and said, quietly, I should have looked at that note the day she gave it to me instead of carrying it around for 2 weeks. I told him I understood, because I did. Looking closely is always harder in the moment than it looks afterward. Here is the part I want to be honest about in the epilogue, because I promised myself I would not tidy this into something cleaner than it actually was. Sandra and her husband's finances, I learned later through Gordon, had been unraveling for a year before the funeral. A failed refinance, a maxed out line of credit, pressure that had nothing to do with honoring my grandfather and everything to do with a hole they were hoping his account could fill quietly. None of that started with his death. It only became visible once his estate sat open long enough for somebody to reach for it. I still keep his roll-top desk in my own den now, the same brass lamp bent at its same slight angle, and Gordon has started stopping by some Sundays, learning slowly how to ask me a real question instead of assuming an answer. He brought his own toolbox over last month, unprompted, to fix a drawer on the desk that had stuck for years, and Miriam Castellano watched him work at it the exact patient way my grandpa Bernard used to work at anything broken, unhurried, unwilling to force a part that wasn't ready to move. I tell my grandfather's stories to anyone who will listen, in pieces small enough to hold, that a signature is not the opposite of love. It sometimes is the last decision somebody gets to make without anyone rewriting it for him. I still send Sandra a card every year on the anniversary, not because I expect a reply, but because closing an account with dignity is a habit I'm not willing to lose just because someone else stopped keeping their side of it. If you have ever watched your own family assign themselves a decision that was never legally theirs to make, I want you to hear this plainly. The people moving fastest to act like something is already settled are usually the ones with the most to lose from you actually checking whether it is. I think about that every time I sit down at a disputed account file at work now. Strangers' names instead of family names, but the same exact question underneath every single one of them.
Who actually has the authority here, and who is simply hoping nobody stops to ask? Now let me tell you what actually happened here, mechanically, because the drama is only half of why I am telling you this story. In most jurisdictions, an executor named in a will has no formal legal authority to move estate assets until the probate court issues Letters Testamentary, a specific document confirming that authority on the record. Until that happens, banks are legally required to freeze estate accounts against any release request, regardless of who claims to already be handling things, because releasing funds to an unverified party exposes the institution to real liability. If your own family is navigating a loved one's estate, you are entitled to request a copy of the filed will and the letters testamentary directly from the probate court, and you are entitled to ask any bank holding estate funds to confirm, in writing, whose name currently holds verified authority before a single dollar moves. A verbal claim about what someone wanted, however often repeated, carries no legal weight against a properly probated will. Tell me in the comments if your own family has ever tried to act on an estate before the paperwork actually agreed with them. And subscribe if you have ever been the one who had to slow an entire room down just long enough for the record to finally speak for itself.